All right, let's dive in. Today, we're going to break down the Nigerian court system. We're talking about its structure, its purpose, and really how justice is supposed to work in the country. Let's get right to it.
So just imagine for a second, you're in a business deal and it goes completely sideways. Or maybe one of your fundamental rights gets violated. Where do you go? What do you do? Well, that's exactly why the courts exist. They're the official place to resolve conflicts when everything else has failed.
So, to make this all make sense, here's our game plan. First, we'll cover the basic role of the courts. Then we'll look at the two main levels of justice. After that, we'll climb the ladder of the most important courts. We'll also tackle the big difference between criminal and civil cases, and finally, we'll zoom in on what's known as a civil wrong.
So, what is a court really for? Well, in Nigeria, you can think of them as the final backstop. You know, when private talks break down and you just can't agree, the courts are designed to step in, interpret the law, and make a final call that everyone has to follow. And this quote right here, it just nails it. The courts aren't just there to settle arguments. Nope, their job is way bigger. They interpret the actual Constitution, they protect your rights as a citizen from being stepped on, and they're basically the ultimate referee in any major legal fight.
So it all boils down to these core functions, and they affect everybody. First, they settle disputes. Could be a small personal issue or a huge corporate fight. Second, they interpret laws, figuring out what all that legal text actually means in the real world. And maybe most importantly, they act as the guardian of your rights.
Okay, so to really see how this all works, we need to look at the basic blueprint of the system. The courts in Nigeria are pretty much split into two main tiers, and each one has a very different job.
And here you can see that split pretty clearly. On one side, you've got the superior courts. Think of these as the heavy hitters, the Supreme Court, the Court of Appeal, the ones that handle the really serious cases and appeals. Then on the other side, you've got the inferior courts. These are the real workhorses of the system, handling tons of local cases in places like magistrate and customary courts.
All right, let's focus on that top tier for a minute. When a big case is decided, or when someone wants to challenge a ruling, it has to follow a very specific path. It's kind of like climbing a ladder, where every single rung is a court with more authority than the one below it.
This shows you the typical journey. A case will often start at a high court. That's because it has what's called original jurisdiction, which is just a fancy way of saying it has the power to hear a case for the very first time. Now, if someone doesn't like that decision, they can take it up to the next rung, the Court of Appeal. And the final stop, the top of the ladder, is the Supreme Court. Their decision is final. That's it.
So, sitting at the very top of that ladder is the Supreme Court. It's the final word on any legal issue in Nigeria. There's nowhere else to go. It's led by the Chief Justice and made up of the country's most experienced judges.
And when I say experienced, I mean it's required by law. You can't even be considered for the Supreme Court unless you have at least 15 years of experience as a lawyer. Right below the Supreme Court, you've got the Court of Appeal. Now, its main job is to hear appeals, but it also has one very specific, very important power. It's the only court that can handle disputes about presidential elections.
And the experience requirement here, 12 years.
And at the bottom of this top tier, you have the high courts. This is where most of the big cases get their start. They have something called unlimited original jurisdiction, which basically means they can hear almost any type of case for the first time.
And for this level, the requirement is 10 years. So you see the system, right? 10, 12, and 15 years. It's a ladder of experience, built on purpose to make sure that the judges with the most power also have the most expertise.
Okay, so we've got the structure. But what kinds of cases do these courts actually hear? Well, pretty much everything falls into two big buckets, criminal and civil. And believe me, the rules of the game for each are totally different.
And the differences are huge. Criminal law is all about punishing someone for a wrong against society. That's why it's always the state versus an accused person. And because someone's freedom is on the line, the standard of proof is super high, beyond a reasonable doubt. Civil law, on the other hand, is about sorting out a fight between two private parties. The goal isn't punishment, it's compensation. So the proof standard is lower, just a preponderance of evidence, which basically means it's more likely than not that one person is responsible.
Now, let's dig into that civil law side of things by looking at a huge area called torts. It's a legal term, but it covers all kinds of situations where one person's actions cause harm or a loss to somebody else.
So what in the world is a tort? Well, think of it like this. It's when you breach a duty the law says you owe to other people. And if you breach that duty and someone gets hurt, the solution isn't jail.
The solution is a civil lawsuit for damages, which usually means money. Now, one of the most interesting ideas in all of tort law is something called vicarious liability. It's a wild concept. It means you can be held legally responsible for something someone else did. The classic example is what the law used to call a master and servant relationship, but today we just say employer and employee.
So how does a court decide if an employer is on the hook? Well, they kind of run through a checklist. Do they tell the employee how to do the job? Do they pay them a salary? Can they hire and fire them? But the single most important question, the one that usually decides the whole thing, is this. Was the employee acting within the scope of their employment when the bad thing happened?
A famous old case makes this crystal clear. A company explicitly told its drivers, "You are forbidden from picking up any unauthorized passengers." One driver ignored that rule, gave someone a lift, and that person got hurt in an accident. The court said the company was not liable. Why? Because by directly disobeying an order, the driver was no longer doing his job. He was, as the law so colorfully puts it, on a frolic of his own.
So at the end of the day, it all comes down to this. For an employer to be held liable, the wrongful act has to be connected to the employee's actual job duties. If the employee goes off and does something completely unrelated, something they were never authorized to do, that responsibility probably stays with them and them alone.
And that old principle leads to a fascinating modern question. Think about a delivery driver today, tracked by GPS every second. If they deviate just a little bit from their route to run a personal errand and they cause a crash, are they on a frolic, or does that constant digital tracking mean they're never really off the clock? That's the kind of question that Nigerian courts have to wrestle with today, applying these old ideas to our brand new world. Thanks for joining this explainer.